This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello, and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Aris, Senior Attending Neurosurgeon.
And I'm Dr. Alara, Research Fellow. Today we're looking at a fascinating new study from the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience titled Biological and Clinical Implications of Autologous Bone Flap Preservation Strategies After Decompressive Craniectomy, a systematic review and meta-analysis.
This is a topic that hits home for every trainee and attending in the field. When we perform a decompressive craniectomy, DC, for refractory intracranial hypertension, whether it's trauma or a massive stroke, we're immediately faced with a secondary problem. What do we do with that bone flap? We want to put it back eventually, but the storage method has always been a point of debate.
Exactly, Dr. Aris. Traditionally, we've relied on two main strategies: cryoconservation, where the bone is stored in a freezer, usually at -80°C, or subcutaneous preservation, where the flap is tucked into a pocket in the patient's own abdominal wall. While both are common, the comparative effectiveness has been, frankly, quite conflicting in the literature.
And that's what makes this 2026 meta-analysis so relevant. They looked at 11 studies involving nearly 1,500 patients. Ilara, walk us through the primary clinical outcomes they investigated.
The researchers focused on three major complications: surgical site infection, SSI, bone flap resorption, BFR, and the overall reoperation rate. To start with the infections, which is always our first concern when reimplanting a flap, they found that there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. Cryopreservation had an infection rate of 6.2% compared to 4.1% in the subcutaneous group. With a p-value of 0.18, we can't say one is definitively safer than the other regarding sepsis.
That's an important point for the residents listening. Even though 4.1% sounds lower than 6.2%, statistically, the neurosurgical toss-up remains regarding infection. However, the study found a much more definitive signal when they looked at bone flap resorption, didn't they?
They did. This is the deep dive part of the paper. Bone flap resorption is the bane of cranioplasty. The meta-analysis revealed that resorption was significantly higher in the cryopreservation group, 15.4%, compared to just 6.8% in the subcutaneous group. That's a p-value of 0.003, which is quite robust.
That is a striking difference. A 15% resorption rate for frozen bone is a real clinical headache, often leading to a failed cranioplasty and the need for expensive synthetic implants. Why do the authors suggest this is happening? What are the biological implications here?
This is where the paper gets into the physiology of the bone. When we use subcutaneous preservation, the bone flap remains in a vascularized, living environment within the patient's own body. The paper notes that this environment may help maintain cellular viability and osteogenic potential. You still have osteocytes and osteoblasts that can potentially participate in the healing process once the bone is returned to the skull.
Right, whereas cryopreservation is essentially a kill strategy for those cells.
Precisely. At -80°, you're preserving the mineral scaffold, but you're essentially devitalizing the tissue. The study suggests that because cryopreserved bone lacks living cells, it relies entirely on creeping substitution from the surrounding native skull for remodeling. If that process is slow or fails, the bone just undergoes resorption. It melts away because it can't biologically integrate.
It's the difference between reimplanting a living tissue and reimplanting a scaffold. Now, did this higher rate of resorption lead to more reoperations in the cryopreservation group?
Interestingly, the meta-analysis showed no significant difference in reoperation rates, with a p-value of 0.21. However, the authors caution that reoperation is often a trailing indicator. While the resorption was higher in frozen flaps, it might not have always reached the clinical threshold where a surgeon decided to take the patient back to the OR during the study's follow-up period.
That's a fair nuance. For the residents and med students listening, the takeaway here is that while infection risks are comparable, the biological health of the bone flap seems much better preserved in a subcutaneous pocket.
Exactly. To summarize the paper's conclusion, subcutaneous preservation is associated with significantly lower rates of bone flap resorption. The authors argue that maintaining that vascularized environment is key to long-term cranioplasty success.
It certainly makes you think twice about the convenience of the freezer versus the extra 15 minutes it takes to create an abdominal pocket. Great summary, Ilara. That's all the time we have for today's episode of the Neurosurgery Hub podcast.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the next episode.